The rugged mountains of eastern Afghanistan existed in a state of permanent twilight, caught between the last fading light of day and the deep, consuming shadows of the approaching night. For the men who operated there, the terrain was as much an enemy as the Taliban fighters who inhabited its caves and crevices. On this particular evening, the air was thin and cold, carrying with it the scent of pine and dust, a deceptive calm that often preceded violence. Night Chief Petty Officer Jason Hayes lay prone on a rocky outcrop, his cheek pressed against the cold stock of his Mk-11 sniper rifle. Through the scope, he watched a small village nestled in the valley below. For the past 36 hours, his four-man SEAL team had been observing this location, tracking the movements of a high-value target known to be meeting with local insurgent leaders. Hayes was the quiet professional, the man his teammates trusted to see the unseen, and to make the shot that no one else could. His eyes, narrowed against the glare of the setting sun, missed nothing. "They're winding down for the night," whispered Lieutenant Commander Thomas T.K. Keating over the comms, his voice a low murmur in Hayes's earpiece. Keating was the team leader, a man with a map burned into his brain and an instinct for danger that had kept them alive through countless insertions. "Looks like our friend is bedding down in the southern compound. Did we maintain position? We'll call in the QRF for the snatch and grab at first light." Behind Hayes, huddled against a large boulder to break the wind, were the other two members of the team. Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Reyes, the communications and explosives expert, and Senior Chief Daniel O'Connell, the second in command. They moved with a practiced economy, their bodies attuned to the mountain. They had been in this spot long enough for the cold to seep into their bones. But no one complained. Complaints were a luxury for men in safe places. Hayes allowed himself a small breath of relief. Another few hours of watch, and they'd be exfiltrated. He adjusted his position slightly, the gravel crunching softly beneath his elbow. It was then that he felt it. A single pebble, dislodged by his movement, skittered down the rock face. It was a tiny sound, insignificant in the grand scheme of the mountains, but it was followed by another sound, the distinct, metallic click of a safety being switched off, and it came from behind them. Hayes's blood ran cold. He didn't move his head, only his eyes. He could see O'Connell, who had also heard it, his body going rigid. In that split second, the world exploded. The silence was shattered by a cacophony of automatic weapons fire. The ambush was sudden, violent, and perfectly executed. The Taliban fighters had somehow climbed the rear face of the mountain, undetected, and were now pouring fire into the SEALs' position. Tracers lit up the twilight like deadly fireflies. The first volley caught Reyes as he was reaching for his radio. He was thrown back against the boulder without a sound. "Contact rear! Contact rear!" Keating yelled, rolling onto his side and returning fire with his M4. Hayes scrambled, his sniper rifle useless at this range and angle. He dropped it, grabbing his own carbine. O'Connell was already up, throwing grenades down the slope. The explosions providing a brief, thunderous counterpoint to the rattle of AK-47s. It was a fierce, brutal fight. The SEALs were the best in the world, but they were caught in a kill sack. Fire came from 3 directions. Hayes saw Keating take a round to the chest, his body armor saving his life, but the impact knocking him senseless. O'Connell, his face a mask of blood from a graze on his scalp, pulled Keating behind cover. Hayes fired until his barrel was scorching, dropping 2 fighters scrambling up the rocks, but for everyone that fell, 2 more seemed to take his place. "Jason, we have to move, now!" O'Connell screamed over the din. The position was lost. They were being overrun. O'Connell hooked his arms under Keating's shoulders. "Covering fire! Go for the draw!" Hayes laid down a base of fire, emptying a magazine and slamming another home. O'Connell dragged the dazed Keating over the crest of the ridge, disappearing from sight. Hayes fired a final burst, then turned to follow. He took 2 steps before a tremendous force slammed into his right leg, just above the knee. It felt like he had been kicked by a mule, a white-hot poker searing through his flesh. His leg buckled, and he crashed to the ground. He looked down. His camouflage was already dark and wet with blood. A bullet had torn through his thigh. He tried to stand, but the leg wouldn't hold him. He crawled, pulling himself with his arms, and the jagged rocks cutting into his palms and knees. He could hear O'Connell yelling his name, the voice sounding distant and panicked. "Go! I'm hit! Go!" Hayes roared back, not wanting them to die trying to save him. He kept crawling, making it over the ridge. Below, he could see O'Connell half-carrying Keating into the tree line of a steep draw. He looked back. The Taliban were cresting the ridge, their dark shapes silhouetted against the last light of the sky. And Hayes knew he couldn't outrun them. He was leaving a trail of blood. He looked at the draw where his friends had disappeared. If he went that way, he would lead the enemy right to them. The decision was instantaneous, made not by his brain, but by the core of his being. He had to give them a chance. With a strength born of desperation, he pushed himself away from the draw, rolling and sliding down a different, steeper slope, away from his teammates. He crashed through a scrub bush, tumbling head over heels, the pain in his leg making him see stars. He landed in a small ravine, the wind knocked out of him. He lay still, listening. He could hear the shouts of the Taliban above, the sounds of their pursuit. They found his blood trail and followed it. But they followed the wrong one. They followed his trail, away from O'Connell and Keating. For hours, Hayes lay there in the freezing dark, drifting in and out of consciousness. He tied a crude tourniquet above his wound, using his belt, a field dressing, and a strip of cloth torn from his undershirt. The bleeding slowed to a seeping ooze. He had no radio. It had been smashed in his fall. He had his carbine, 3 magazines, a single canteen of water, and a K-bar knife. He was alone, deep in enemy-dominated territory, with a hole in his leg. Back at the forward operating base, the news hit the command center like a physical blow, and the SEAL team had missed their scheduled check-in. A drone was redirected to their last known coordinates. What it found was a scene of carnage, brass casings glinting in the morning sun, blood-soaked rocks, and signs of a violent battle, but no bodies, no SEALs. They had simply vanished. The initial report was grim. 4 SEALs, contact with the enemy, current location and status unknown. The unspoken word hung in the air, lost. A hush fell over the room, 4 of their best, gone. Then, and a faint encrypted signal was picked up by a signals intelligence unit. It was a short, broken burst of data from a PRR, a personal roll radio, one of the small, short-range devices the SEALs used for team communication. It was too weak to be a regular transmission, bouncing off a satellite or reaching a distant base. It was a signal meant for someone very close. And it carried a single, desperate message. 2 survivors. Exfil Point Bravo, 1 KIA. It was from O'Connell, and he and Keating had made it to a pre-planned emergency extraction point, a small, flat area hidden in the draw, and Reyes was gone. But there was no mention of Hayes. The 2 survivors, exhausted and wounded themselves, had no idea what had happened to their teammate after he fell. The last they saw, he was on the ground, the enemy closing in. The mission was now a rescue, and it fell to the Army's 75th Ranger Regiment. A platoon of Rangers, already on standby as a quick reaction force, was scrambled. They were the tip of the spear, the men sent in when things went sideways. Their creed was simple. I will never leave a fallen comrade. They loaded into MH-47 Chinook helicopters, the massive birds thrumming with power as they lifted off into the moonless night. Their job was twofold: extract the 2 known survivors, O'Connell and Keating, and then find the missing man, Jason Hayes. They were inserting into a hot LZ, as an area that was now swarming with Taliban who were likely hunting for the Americans themselves. The lead ranger, a young but seasoned sergeant first class named Matt Wilkes, looked at his men. Their faces were painted with green and black camouflage, their eyes hard and focused. They knew the odds. They knew the risks. They went anyway. As the helicopters roared over the mountains, Hayes was shivering uncontrollably in his ravine. The cold was the worst part. It seeped into his bones, and making the pain in his leg feel like a distant, dull roar. He had heard the faint sounds of the initial firefight ending, then the terrifying silence. He didn't know if O'Connell and Keating had made it. He didn't know if anyone was coming for him. He was a ghost, alone in the wilderness. He forced himself to stay awake. To sleep was to die. He thought of his wife, Sarah, back home in Virginia Beach. He thought of his daughter, Chloe, who was only 3 years old. And he thought of the backyard deck he had promised to build last summer. These thoughts were anchors, keeping him tethered to the world of the living. He had to survive. He had to get back to them. As the first gray light of dawn began to seep over the mountains, Hayes heard a new sound. It wasn't the crack of gunfire or the shouts of men. It was the distant, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of helicopter rotors. His heart leaped. But the sound wasn't coming closer. It was staying in one place, to the north. He knew that area. It was a small plateau, a potential landing zone. It had to be them. It had to be a rescue force. He had to move. He had to let them know he was alive. Wilkes's Rangers fast roped onto the LZ, their boots hitting the ground with soft thuds. They immediately set up a perimeter, their weapons scanning the surrounding hills. The landing zone was cold, no enemy fire. They quickly linked up with O'Connell and Keating, who were in bad shape, but alive. And the two SEALs were loaded onto the medevac chopper, which lifted off immediately, its departure thunderous. But Wilkes and his men stayed. They were now on the ground, alone, with one objective: find Hayes. The drone was retasked, scanning the terrain where the SEALs had been hit. It picked up a heat signature, faint and flickering in a small ravine a half-click from the main fight. It was a strange spot, not a place a trained operator would choose to hide. It could be a local shepherd, the drone operator said over the comms. But it's the only thing moving in that entire sector. It's him, Wilkes said, a certainty in his voice that he couldn't explain. It has to be. Let's move. The Rangers moved out, a disciplined column of ghosts flowing through the trees. They moved with incredible speed and stealth, their years of training taking over. They descended into the draw and began climbing the opposite slope towards the ravine. But the terrain was brutal, loose rocks and steep inclines threatening to turn an ankle or snap a leg with every step. Hayes heard them before he saw them, the soft scuff of a boot, the controlled breathing of men climbing hard. He couldn't risk calling out. He didn't know if it was friend or foe. He pulled his carbine close, ready to defend himself to his last breath. He peered over the edge of the ravine. Through the scrub, he saw a figure, an American uniform, then another, and another. They were Rangers. They were here. A wave of emotion, so powerful it almost made him sob, washed over him. They had come. They hadn't left him. He tried to stand, to wave, but his leg screamed in protest, and he fell back. Instead, he grabbed a rock and banged it against the stone wall of the ravine. Clink, clink, clink. The lead ranger, a point man, froze. He held up a fist, signaling a halt. He listened. Clink, clink. It was a signal, but was it a trap? He signaled for Wilkes. Wilkes crept forward, listening. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate. It wasn't random. Hayes? He whispered into the darkness, his voice barely audible. Chief Hayes? If that's you, make the sound twice. Clink, clink. A grin spread across Wilkes's face. Contact! Friendly! Medic up! They found him crumpled at the bottom of the ravine, his face pale, his lips blue, his eyes wide with a mixture of pain and disbelief. The medic, a young specialist named Alvarez, immediately went to work, cutting away Hayes's pant leg to assess the wound. "Chief, you are one tough son of a bitch," Alvarez muttered as he administered morphine and started an IV. Hayes grabbed Wilkes's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "O'Connell? Keating?" "They're safe," Wilkes assured him. "They're on their way home. You led them away. You saved them." The relief on Hayes's face was palpable. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. "There are 4 Rangers here," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "You came for me." "There are 4 Rangers here." He looked at each of their faces, committing them to memory. "I'm going home with you." Getting him out was a nightmare. A Stabo extraction was out of the question in this terrain and with his wound. They would have to carry him. The Rangers built an improvised stretcher from a poncho and 2 tree branches. They took turns carrying him, a human chain of determination and brotherhood, hauling him back down the ravine, through the draw, and up the steep slope towards a new extraction point. The sun was fully up now, exposing them. As they climbed, the first shots rang out. A Taliban fighter on a distant ridge had spotted them. The Rangers returned fire, the crack of M4s echoing through the mountains. Wilkes coordinated the defense, his men fighting a rear-guard action as they moved. Hayes, despite his pain, held his carbine, ready to fire if the enemy got too close. It was a running gun battle, a desperate race against time. But the Rangers, burdened with their wounded charge, moved with agonizing slowness. The Taliban were getting bolder, their fire more accurate. One round zipped past Hayes's head, so close he felt the wind of its passage. Finally, they crested the last ridge. Below them, on a flat piece of land, sat 2 MH-60 Blackhawks, their rotors turning, their door gunners scanning the ridges. It was the most beautiful sight Hayes had ever seen. "Go! Go! Go!" Wilkes yelled. The Rangers poured down the slope, dragging the stretcher. They piled into the helicopters, the door gunners unleashing a torrent of fire at the pursuing Taliban. As the Blackhawks lifted off, the ground fell away, and the mountains of Afghanistan shrank beneath them. Inside the helicopter, Hayes lay on the floor, Alvarez still working on him. Wilkes sat against the bulkhead, breathing heavily, his uniform soaked with sweat. He looked at Hayes, who was looking back at him. "Told you," Hayes said, his voice barely audible over the rotors. 4 Rangers." Wilkes just nodded, a tired smile on his face. Back at the base, the scene was chaotic. Medical personnel swarmed the helicopter as soon as its wheels touched the tarmac. Hayes was lifted out, his stretcher rushed to the waiting aid station. As they wheeled him away, he saw O'Connell, bandaged but standing, watching him. Their eyes met, and in that look was a conversation that needed no words. They were alive. They were home. And the story of the rescue spread like wildfire through the special operations community. A SEAL sniper, left for dead, had sacrificed his own chance at escape to save his teammates. He had survived alone, wounded, in the harshest of environments. And 4 Rangers, defying logic and convention, had walked into the heart of enemy territory and brought him out. Months later, Jason Hayes sat on his newly built deck in Virginia Beach, the Virginia summer sun warm on his face. He still walked with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of that night. Chloe, now 4, played with her dolls at his feet. Sarah sat beside him, her hand in his. He looked at the small, framed photograph on the table beside him. It wasn't of his family, though there were plenty of those inside. It was a photo taken right after the rescue, a grainy, tired picture of him surrounded by 4 men in dirty, sweat-stained combat uniforms. Sergeant First Class Matt Wilkes and his Rangers. And they had given him his life back. He thought about the creed, the one that the Rangers lived by. I will never leave a fallen comrade. He thought about the weight of those words, the incredible burden and promise they carried. He knew, with absolute certainty, that they were not just words. They were a bond, stronger than blood. They had left the wire, gone down range, and into the unknown for him. They had risked everything, and they had brought him home. The title of the story, and the one the men at the base whispered in awe, was simple. They said, "She's lost! They deserted the SEAL Marksman. Then she returned, leading 4 Rangers." The she was a strange way to refer to a man, but in the confusing, adrenaline-soaked reports and the chaos of battle, things got misconstrued. But the truth was far more powerful. They hadn't deserted him. They had come back. And he, the lost SEAL, hadn't just been found. Then he had been carried home on the shoulders of 4 men who lived by a code that meant something. And in his heart, for the rest of his life, Jason Hayes would carry them right back.